Welcome to episode 12. There is absolutely no silhouette in all of cinematic history more instantly recognizable than that of the little man with the bowler hat, the oversized shoes, and that flimsy bamboo cane. But right behind all that laughter, behind the pure, unparalleled genius of Charlie Chaplin, there's a deeply poignant, intensely dramatic final act of his life that honestly rarely gets the spotlight it deserves. In this explainer, we're going to look really closely at the twilight of a legend. We'll trace a journey of heartbreak, quiet resilience, and ultimately, redemption. And just a quick note before we get started, this video is for educational purposes and created under fair use principles.
Okay, let's dive into this, because this is a story that feels like it was pulled straight out of a Hollywood script, yet it was painfully real. For nearly 40 years, Charlie Chaplin was the undisputed king of American cinema. I mean, he built an empire from the ground up, making the entire world laugh and cry, often at the exact same time. But what happens when the country that elevated you to the status of a living god suddenly decides it just doesn't want you anymore? How does a banished genius, a man who literally helped create the American film industry, find closure and find his way home?
Part 1. The Bitter Exile. Let's move to and see how this builds, because to truly understand the sheer magnitude of his eventual return, we first have to understand the absolute heartbreak of his departure. By the early 1950s, Cold War anxieties in the US were peaking, and Chaplin, with his fiercely independent mindset and those socially conscious films, well, he found himself caught right in the crosshairs of an FBI investigation and political accusations. In September 1952, he departs for London with his family on the RMS Queen Elizabeth, only to receive the shocking news mid-voyage that his U.S. re-entry permit had just been suddenly revoked. So instead of going back to face a tribunal, he sends his wife, Una, back to settle their affairs, and they settle into a permanent, peaceful exile in Switzerland by 1953. And then finally, in 1955, he severed his ultimate professional cord to Hollywood, selling his remaining stock in United Artists. That was the very studio he had co-founded back in 1919.
And this brilliantly illustrates a really hard truth. When Chaplin was effectively exiled, you'd probably expect the industry he helped build to just rally behind him in outrage, right? But they didn't. Out of the entire movie industry, only 3 prominent figures actually had the courage to publicly stand up and say that banishing Chaplin was a terrible mistake: producer Sam Goldwyn, actor Cary Grant, and director William Wyler. The rest of Hollywood, the massive studios, the actors, the powerful executives, they remained a silent majority. They simply turned the other cheek, completely ignoring the fact that a founding father of their own art form had just been driven away.
Part 2. A Triumphant Return.
History has a remarkable way of correcting itself. 20 years pass, the political temperature finally cools down, and by 1972, the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences realizes that a massive historical injustice had occurred. So they reached out to offer Chaplin an honorary Oscar for the incalculable effect he has had in making motion pictures the art form of this century. Now, he was initially pretty hesitant. The wounds of 1952 were still deep, but his classic films were experiencing this massive global resurgence at the time. So he finally decided to accept the invitation, returning to the United States entirely on his own terms. Older, for sure, physically frailer, but undeniably victorious. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is the number 12. 12 minutes. When Charlie Chaplin walked out onto that stage at the Academy Awards in 1972, the entire auditorium rose to their feet. And they stayed on their feet for 12 consecutive minutes. It was, and honestly still remains, the absolute longest standing ovation in the history of the Oscars. Visibly moved, frail, and so emotional, Chaplin stood before the very industry that had once turned its back on him as they just poured out decades of pent-up gratitude, respect, and perhaps a collective apology. Yet amidst all those flashing cameras and the roaring applause, who was the man inside? His son, Sidney Chaplin, later observed something so beautiful. He said that to his father, the golden statues and the big accolades meant very little. His true image of himself was simply as a workman. He was a guy who believed in showing up every single day, refining a script or reworking a scene until it was absolutely perfect. It was never really about the glamour for him. It was all about that daily, disciplined devotion to his craft.
Part 3. Twilight in Switzerland.
After that incredible emotional zenith in Hollywood, Chaplin went back home to his sanctuary. Far away from the glaring lights of Los Angeles, his world centered around a quiet, inward turning at the Manoir de Ban. This was a stunning 35-acre estate overlooking Lake Geneva, where he deeply bonded with his wife Una and their kids. But his creative spark? That never dimmed. He actively curated his own legacy, reissuing his classic silent films and composing beautiful brand-new musical scores for them. Sadly, though, This era was also marked by a slow physical decline following a series of minor strokes. It's tough to think about, but this once incredibly agile, highly physical performer was eventually confined to a wheelchair.
Part 4. Arise, Sir Charles. Even as his body weakened, his global stature only grew. The little boy who had escaped the brutal, tragic poverty of the Victorian London slums was finally ready for formal recognition by the British Crown. In the 1975 New Year honors, he was awarded a knighthood. But there is a quiet, immensely powerful dignity to the ceremony itself. When it came time to receive the honor from Queen Elizabeth II, Sir Charles Spencer Chaplin was too weak to stand or kneel for the traditional dubbing of the sword. So, the crucial point is, he received his knighthood sitting triumphantly in his wheelchair. The world's greatest physical comedian, immobilized by time, receiving his native country's highest artistic blessing.
Part 5. The Final Curtain. By the late autumn of 1977, Chaplin required constant care. And in the early morning hours of Christmas Day, 1977, he passed away peacefully in his sleep at his home in Switzerland, following a final stroke. He was 88 years old. In accordance with his strict personal wishes, there was no massive global spectacle for his funeral, no big Hollywood send-off. Instead, it was a small, intimate, private Anglican ceremony. He was laid to rest in the local cemetery in Coursier-sur-Vevey, surrounded by the quiet, beautiful Swiss landscape he had grown to love so much. While his physical life had ended, the absolute outpouring of love from his peers forever cemented his immortality. The French director, René Clair, captured the sentiment of the entire world perfectly, calling him a monument of the cinema of all countries and all times, the most beautiful gift the cinema made to us. And Bob Hope? He simply added, "We were lucky to have lived in his time." The man was gone, yes, but the immense gratitude of an entire century remained.
Part 6. The Immortal Tramp. Now, we can't just end a story about Charlie Chaplin with his passing, right? Because he achieved something so few artists ever do. He created a legacy that completely transcended the man himself. He gave us the tramp. Think about it. Just a shabby little figure in a derby hat, a jacket that was way too tight, pants and boots that were far too large, and that flimsy bamboo cane. With this simple, perfectly paradoxical costume, Chaplin transmuted his own tragic experiences of Victorian London poverty into the purest comedy the world had ever seen. The tramp wasn't just a funny character, he was the ultimate representative of the forgotten man. No matter how many times he got knocked down by society, by machinery, by the wealthy, he always dusted off his jacket, tipped his hat, and just waddled toward the horizon. He symbolized the hopes, the endless defeats, and the unyielding optimism of all humanity.
So, as we look back at this incredible life, from the slums of London to the mansions of Hollywood to the bitter exile and finally to those peaceful Swiss mountains, we have to ask ourselves, what remains when the laughter stops? When the film reels finally end and the lights come up in the theater, what has Charlie Chaplin actually left us?
He left us a mirror. The tramp endures as a universal symbol of humanity transcending time, transcending language, and completely transcending borders. Whether you're watching him in 1914 or today, he reminds us of our own fragility, our own ridiculousness, and our own remarkable ability to survive. Chaplin's work continues to resonate so deeply because, at its core, it is the story of us all. As we continue to navigate a world that often feels totally chaotic and overwhelming, how often do we remember to just dust off our jackets, tip our hats, and keep walking toward the horizon? Please do not forget to like the video and subscribe to our channel, Famous Lives Bio.